In 1887, on a steep slope above central Idaho's North Fork of the Clearwater River, a man by the name of Pyotr Zelenko stood on a crossbeam 138 feet above a ravine floor that remained hidden from view through the trees. The beam consisted of Douglas fir, measuring 12 inches square. It was damp. The morning fog had yet to burn away, leaving the wood slick with moisture that had settled overnight and blended with pitch and sawdust. Zelenko held a drift pin in his left hand and a 10 lb sledgehammer in his right. The drift pin was an iron rod, 18 inches long and an inch in diameter. He was forcing it through a pre-drilled hole linking two timbers at a joint 138 feet in the air. Every swing of the hammer sent a tremor through the beam beneath his feet. That beam was not yet bolted down. It rested on a capped timber, which sat atop a wooden post, which stood on a sill, which rested on a mud pad, which lay on the mountainside. Nothing below him was fixed permanently. Everything below him consisted of wood, gravity, and the friction between rough, cut surfaces pressed together by the weight of the construction above. That construction was a railroad trestle. Upon completion, it would bear the tracks of the Northern Pacific Railroad across a ravine 40 feet wide and 156 deep. The entire framework would be built from wood, Douglas fir harvested from the very mountains it was designed to traverse. No steel would feature in the structure, nor concrete, nor rivets, nor any iron except the drift pins securing the joints and the spikes holding the rails. Everything else was timber, stacked, braced, and pinned by men standing on the very pieces they were joining, using tools carried in their belts at heights that would not see safety lines for another 5 decades. This was the method by which the American railroad conquered the mountains. Not with bridges of steel and stone, but with wooden towers. Temporary structures intended to last 5 years, though some endured for 30. They were called timber trestles, and between 1860 and 1910, over 500 of them were erected across the canyons and mountains of the American West. Here is what made them essential. The Transcontinental railroads confronted a problem that no sum of money could simplify. The routes they carved crossed terrain that dropped away abruptly. A rail line winding through the Cascades, the Bitterroots, or the Sierra Nevada would meet a ravine every few miles, sometimes every few hundred yards. Each ravine demanded crossing. The track could not detour, as the mountains on either side were steeper than any locomotive could manage. It could not descend and re-ascend, for the gradient would prove too extreme. What the railroad required was a level crossing, a flat span across empty air, held aloft by something robust enough to support a locomotive weighing 80 tons. A steel bridge offered the permanent answer, but such a bridge required 18 months to design, fabricate, and erect. The railroad companies were racing one another for land grants and government subsidies, awarded based on miles of completed track. They could not afford 18 months at every ravine. So, they turned to timber trestles. A timber trestle could be raised in 6 to 12 weeks, using materials felled from the forest on either side of the gap. The wood cost nothing. The labor came cheap. The structure was provisional. The strategy remained consistent: build the trestle, lay the track, run the trains, and later replace the wood with steel or fill. Some were replaced. Many were not. Here is how a timber trestle was constructed. The crew commenced at the ravine's bottom, if they could reach it, though many ravines offered no floor a man could stand on, just a creek bed choked with boulders and fallen timber on a slope too steep for a foundation. In such cases, the crew carved a trail down the ravine side by hand, clearing trees with axes and crosscut saws, dragging the logs out with mules and oxen. The foundation posed the first challenge. A timber trestle rested on mud sills, flat timbers laid directly on the ground. On rock, The sill was set on a leveled surface chipped out with hand tools. On soil, the crew dug down to firm ground and placed the sill on a pad of crushed rock carried in by hand. The sill had to be level. If not, every timber above it would be out of plumb, and a locomotive passing overhead would push the structure sideways instead of straight down. Upon the mud sills, the crew erected posts. These were the vertical timbers that transmitted the track's weight to the ground. On a tall trestle, posts could reach 40, 60, or even 80 feet in length. Each was a single Douglas fir log, stripped of bark, squared on four sides with a broadaxe, and raised into position by hand. Raising a post weighing 3,000 lb and standing 70 feet tall was accomplished with gin poles and rope. A crew of 12 to 16 men hauled on a line threaded through a block at the gin pole's top. The post rose from horizontal to vertical, swinging through an arc capable of killing any man it struck. Once vertical, it was held in place by temporary braces while the crew positioned the next one. The posts were linked at the top by cap timbers, horizontal beams spanning from post to post. On the caps, the crew laid stringers, the long timbers running in the track's direction and supporting the rails. The stringers were the heaviest individual timbers in the structure, often 16 inches square and 30 feet long, weighing close to 2,000 lb each. They were hoisted to the trestle's top by rope and block and positioned by hand. Every connection in the structure was made with drift pins. A drift pin joint functioned as follows. 2 timbers were set in position. A hole was bored through both pieces using a hand auger, a tool resembling a large corkscrew, turned by 2 men gripping a crossbar. The hole was slightly smaller in diameter than the drift pin. The pin was then driven through the hole with a sledge. The friction of iron against green wood held the joint together. There were no bolts, nuts, or washers, just iron rods hammered into wood by sheer force. A single bent of a trestle, one vertical frame comprising posts, sills, caps, and braces, could require 40 or more drift pins. A trestle with 30 bents used over one's 200 pins. Every one of them was driven by a man standing on the structure with a sledgehammer. The men who built timber trestles were called bridge carpenters. They were not finish carpenters. They were not house framers. They were men who worked with timbers, weighing a ton at heights that terrified most, in terrain unreachable by road. The crews typically numbered 20 to 40 men, organized into squads. The fallers cut the timber. The hewers squared it. The framers cut the joints. The raisers erected the bents. The pin men drove the drift pins. The track gang followed behind, laying rails on the finished structure, sometimes before the bracing was complete. The crews were paid $1.50 to $2.50 a day in the 1880s and 1890s. They lived in camps near the construction site, sleeping in canvas tents or rough, sawn bunkhouses thrown together from scrap lumber. The fare was beans, salt pork, bread, and coffee. The work spanned 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. In summer, the heat in the ravines was brutal. The air hung still. The men labored in heavy boots and wool trousers, soaked with sweat by mid-morning. In winter, the conditions reversed. The timber froze. The drift pins would not seat. The auger holes cracked the wood, and the men worked with numb hands on beams coated in ice. The danger was unrelenting, and it arose from the material itself. Green timber is unpredictable. A Douglas fir log that appears sound can harbor an internal check. A crack running through the hardwood, invisible from the outside. When load is applied, the timber splits without warning. A post that fails under a loaded stringer's weight does not bend, it explodes. The fibers separate with a sound like gunfire, and the timber disintegrates into pieces that fly outward with lethal force. Men fell from the structures. The work platforms were loose planks laid across the framing, at whatever height the crew was working. The planks were not fastened, They shifted underfoot. A man carrying a drift pin in one hand and a sledge in the other had no free hand to catch himself. Falls of 40, 80, or 120 feet were recorded in foreman's logs across the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern, and the Union Pacific lines. The survival rate from falls over 50 feet was near zero. Gin pole accidents claimed men on the ground. A rope under tension stores enormous energy. When a rope parted during a lift, the severed end whipped back with enough force to shatter bones. A timber being raised could swing free and drop onto the crew below. These were termed struck by. Deaths in railroad company records, accounting for nearly a third of all fatalities on trestle construction sites. I want to tell you about one of them. His name was Pyotr Zelenko. I discovered him in the Northern Pacific Railroad's Engineering Division records, filed in the Montana Historical Society archives, cross-referenced with a Shoshone County, Idaho, coroner's entry from October 1887. Zelenko was 31 years old. He was born in a village outside Lviv, in what was then the Austro-Hungarian province of Galicia. He arrived in the United States in 1883. He worked as a lumber hand in Minnesota for 2 years before joining a Northern Pacific bridge crew in 1885. The foreman's log lists him as a pin man. His job was to drive drift pins at the joints of the trestle framing, working at whatever height the structure had reached. On the morning of October 9, 1887, Zelenko was driving a drift pin at a joint on the fourth bent of the Clearwater Ravine trestle, 138 feet above the ravine floor. The beam he stood on had been placed 20 minutes earlier. It rested on the cap timber, but had not yet been pinned. As Zelenko swung the sledgehammer, the recoil shifted the beam. The beam moved less than 2 inches. That was enough. Zelenko's right foot stepped onto air where timber had been. He dropped the hammer. He reached for the cap timber. He did not reach it. He fell 138 ft to the ravine floor. The coroner recorded the cause of death as injuries consistent with a fall from great height. The Northern Pacific paid his final wages, 14 for 6 days of work, to a cousin in St. Paul. No record of any further payment exists. The foreman's log notes that the crew was back at full strength the following morning. A new pin man had been hired from the camp. The fatality data for timber trestle construction has never been compiled into a single source. The work was performed by private contractors for railroad companies that were not required to report workplace deaths to any federal agency until 1910. However, the fragmentary records that survive, coroner's ledgers, company injury logs, foreman's reports, cemetery records from railroad towns, suggest a rate of roughly 1 death per trestle for structures over 100 feet tall. In the peak years of Western railroad construction, the 1880s and 1890s, between 80 and 120 trestles of that height were built annually. The arithmetic carries the same weight it always does. The timber trestles were meant to be temporary. Most of them were not. Replacing a trestle with a permanent steel bridge or an earthen fill required halting train traffic on the line for weeks or months. The railroad companies delayed the replacements. They dispatched inspection crews instead. The inspectors walked the trestles on foot, looking for rot, insect damage, fire damage, and structural settlement. When a timber failed, it was replaced individually, a process called piecework that kept the trestle standing, one repair at a time, for decades past its intended lifespan. Some of the trestles caught fire. A spark from a locomotive smokestack could ignite the creosote-soaked timbers. A trestle fire burned fast and burned completely. The structure collapsed into the ravine in minutes, leaving nothing but charred stumps and twisted iron pins. When a trestle burned, the railroad simply built another one in the same place. Some ravine crossings went through 3 or 4 wooden trestles before a permanent bridge was finally erected. By the 1920s, Most of the great timber trestles had been replaced with steel or concrete or filled in with earth hauled by steam shovels. The bridge carpenters moved on to other work or retired. The skills they possessed, the ability to read green timber, to raise a 70-foot post with rope and gin pole, to drive a drift pin on a beam 140 feet in the air. Those skills were not transmitted. There was no apprenticeship program. There was no manual. The knowledge resided in the hands and eyes of the men who performed the work, and when they stopped, it vanished. A few of the trestles still stand. You can find them on abandoned rail lines in Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington. Wooden towers rising out of ravines filled with second-growth timber. The posts are gray and checked. The cap timbers sag. The drift pins have rusted to dark brown streaks running down the wood. They are not safe to walk on. They are not maintained. They are simply still there because no one has torn them down. If you stand at the edge of one and look along its length, you can discern the logic of the structure. Every post, every brace, every cap is doing exactly one thing: carrying weight straight down to the ground. Nothing is decorative. Nothing is wasted. The men who built these trestles understood forces the way a carpenter understands wood. They did not calculate, they saw. They knew where a timber would fail by looking at it, the way a sailor knows weather by scanning the sky. The Pyotr Zelenkos, the pin men, the hewers, the raisers, the fallers. Men who came from Galicia and Scandinavia and Quebec and the cutover counties of Michigan and Wisconsin. They are not in the history books. They are in the payroll stubs, the coroner's filings, and the foreman's logs sitting in archive boxes in county courthouses across the Mountain West. But every rail line that crossed a ravine in the American mountains was carried on wood that those men cut, raised, and pinned together by hand, standing on the pieces they were building with nothing beneath them but air and the sound of a creek they could not see. If you found this story worth hearing, hit subscribe for more accounts of the men who built America by hand. Here is another video you will find interesting. Go watch that one next. Goodbye.